Welcome back to Philosophy 202. Today we're going to be talking about friendship and epistemology, and specifically whether the norms of friendship ever conflict with epistemic norms. So in other words, whether being a good friend ever requires being a bad believer. So we're going to start with talking about the conflict thesis, according to which the norms of epistemology can conflict with the norms of friendship. This is the thesis defended by Simon Keller in the article you read for this class, as well as by Sarah Stroud, who wrote the optional reading for today. Note that this isn't a canonical name. I'm just giving it the name, the conflict thesis, for ease of reference. So let's start by getting clear on what these norms are. What exactly does it mean to say that the norms of epistemology can conflict with the norms of friendship? So first, Keller helpfully gives us some definitions of each. He says that norms of friendship are truths about what you should do insofar as you are a particular person's good friend. So for example, a good friend ought to keep in touch, do their friend favors, be available when the friend is in need, maybe give airport rides, etc. Be available during breakups. Norms of epistemology, or what we can call epistemic norms for short, are truths about what you should do insofar as you are an agent who forms and holds beliefs and who is answerable to reasons for doing so. So for example, it seems like you should believe things that are overwhelmingly supported by the evidence, and you shouldn't believe things that have very little evidential support or just because they make you happy. So what are some epistemic norms? This is important to get clearer on because this is what will give rise to, help give rise to the conflict that these authors see. So many philosophers endorse this view called evidentialism as a core epistemic norm, and it should be pretty clear why when we see what it says. According to evidentialism, agents ought to believe that P if and only if their evidence supports P. So in other words, whether you should believe something depends entirely on the evidence for it. So for example, Elise ought to believe that tofu is nutritious if and only if my evidence supports that tofu is nutritious. So if I have read conclusive studies that soy affects hormones in some way that makes it more likely to get cancer or whatever, then I shouldn't believe that tofu is nutritious. I don't know if the latest verdict is on that, by the way. Another example, Josh ought not believe that eating barbecue chips is healthy if he has overwhelming evidence that they're unhealthy. So for example, if he has evidence that they have a lot of saturated fat and also has good evidence that saturated fat is really bad for you. So some philosophers also endorse a truth norm. This is more controversial, but it's useful to flag. According to a truth norm, S ought to believe that P if and only if P is true. So in general, a lot of evidentialists think only truth-related or evidence-related considerations count as reasons for whether or not you should believe things. This is controversial, but it's typically widely accepted. Okay, now we're sowing the seeds of conflict. What are some candidate norms of friendship? So one that's relevant for us is that good friends are more reluctant to form negative or unflattering beliefs about their friends. So Sarah Stroud writes, a good friend's epistemic stance seems to involve a relative, although not an absolute, imperviousness to new evidence, a slowness to update her beliefs in light of the new data. So for example, if a reliable source tells you that your friend ghosted their most recent partner, maybe you're a little bit less likely to update on that belief. Whereas if they said that to you about a stranger, you would be more likely to believe it right away. So again, you would be just more reluctant to form this belief. It's not to say that no amount of evidence would convince you, but you would just be a little bit more charitable. And this brings us to the second norm. Good friends are disposed to interpret their friends' actions or projects, etc., more sympathetically than just strangers. So, for instance, Keller argues that the fact that Rebecca is Eric's friend in that poetry reading example is a reason for him to listen with a more sympathetic ear. So we can start to see how this gives rise to a conflict with the epistemic norms that we just saw. And the reason is that the fact that someone is your friend does not always or typically make it more likely that they are good at poetry, that their startup will pan out, that they'll get into a good law school, etc. It also doesn't make it less likely that they ghosted someone, at least not necessarily. Again, I say not necessarily because, as Keller notes, we don't just choose our friends at random. We choose them partly based on the good qualities that we think that they have. So here's an example that I came up with to draw out what this alleged conflict is. It's very much too real. So Rachel and Monica have recently been certified as Soul Cycle instructors. Elise I have really good evidence that classes taught by newly certified Soul Cycle instructors tend to be terrible, or at least not worth the $25 price tag. Their motivational slogans fall flat. They tend to utter absurdities like being at Soul Cycle is like being in the army, based on a true story, and the workout just feels too easy. However, Rachel happens to be one of Elise's good friends. So Elise believes that Rachel's class will be good, and she happily books the class. By contrast, Elise has never met Monica. When she sees her name on the schedule, she just believes, as she normally does, that her classes are not going to be worth the money. They're not going to be good. So, according to the norms of friendship that we just saw, it seems like I, being a good friend, should believe that Rachel's class is going to be a good one. In fact, it doesn't make sense why I would sign up for her class if I didn't think that it would be good, unless I were just sort of play acting, and we'll get back to that in a second. So it seems like, according to the norms of friendship, I ought to believe that Rachel's class will be good. But now, looking at the norms of epistemology, it doesn't seem like my belief is based in the evidence. In fact, I have more evidence to the contrary. And it also doesn't seem to be more true than that Monica's class will be good. So it seems like I ought not believe that Rachel's class will be good according to the epistemic norms. So we have a clear conflict here. According to one set of norms, I ought to do something, but according to another set of norms, I ought not to. So what are some objections to the conflict thesis? So option one is to reject the alleged norms of friendship. So in this case, we might claim that it's actually not a norm of friendship to be biased toward your friend, or to be more charitable toward them, or more sympathetic, or whatever it is. We just should believe whatever the evidence supports about our friends, and that's still consistent with being as good of a friend as you could be. A worry about this response is that it would need to explain away some of our intuitions to the contrary. So it does seem like you would be hurt if you found out that your friend didn't believe that you would be able to get into a good law school. Even if they were really good at play acting and pretending that they believe that you would get into a good law school, you would still be crushed if you found out that they didn't actually have this sort of have this belief about you. Moreover, as Keller points out, it seems like one thing that makes friendship valuable is that we know that someone's on our side, that someone's rooting for us, and we want friends to play that role. Again, we don't just merely want them to act as if they believe these good things about them, we want them to genuinely believe them. That's not to say that this response or that this objection totally fails. It's just that this is a burden that it would need to discharge in order to be a good response to the conflict thesis. So a second objection to the conflict thesis is to reject the alleged epistemic norms, like the evidentialist norm that we saw earlier. A worry about this response is that it's not clear then what epistemic norms are sensitive to if they're not sensitive to things like evidence and truth. So for instance, when someone asks us why we believe that P, we typically try to cite the evidence that we have for P. We don't just say things like, oh, well, I felt like it, or because that person is my friend, or because it makes me happy, right? These are not good epistemic reasons, according to most people. So a third option is to accept the candidate epistemic norms and the norms on friendship, but argue that they don't actually conflict. It's just that we're missing part of the story. So option A is to say that we didn't actually take into account the relevant background information when we were making our judgments in the soul cycle case. So for example, when we take into account information we have about, say, Rachel, we can actually explain why we're epistemically justified in being biased toward our friends. Oops, that's a typo. I'll fix it later. So for example, I might have excellent evidence that Rachel excels at everything that she does and that she's a really authentic person. She wouldn't just like say bullshit during a soul cycle class. And this defeats my justified assumption that most new instructors are bad, or rather like a justified belief. I have a lot of evidence for it. One question for this response is whether it will work in all cases. So we don't, as Keller notes, we don't always have the relevant, it's not always clear that relevant background information is going to explain why we should be more sympathetic to our friends. So for example, I don't know about you, but I don't have that much evidence about whether a lot of my friends will be good or bad at poetry. I don't know what I would use as a proxy for it. Like, sure, they might excel at a lot of things, but most people don't excel at everything. The second option is to argue that evidence is permissive. According to permissivists, there are multiple different permissible responses to a single body of evidence. So in the cases that motivate the conflict thesis, it's not the case that the evidence is conclusive either way. Rather, it's that it seems like it's subject to different possible interpretations. And perhaps we could use this fact to sort of dissolve the conflict. So for example, we might be able to say that I'm actually epistemically permitted to believe that Rachel's soul cycle class will be good because the evidence can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. We could also conclude that I'm epistemically permitted to believe that Monica's soul cycle class will be good. Again, if this is correct, we wouldn't have any conflict because we would have it be the case that I ought, according to the norms of friendship, believe that Rachel's soul cycle class will be good, and I'm permitted to believe that her soul cycle class will be good. And these things no longer conflict. This no longer says that I ought not believe. A first worry is that permissivism is controversial, so we sort of just kick the can down. A second, though, more important worry, I think, is that we can still get conflicts. It's a little bit less straightforward, but the idea is that according to the norms of friendship, it's not just the case that I ought to believe that Rachel's soul cycle class will be good. I therefore, and this is just actually like it logically follows, but don't worry about why. I ought not believe that Rachel's soul cycle class will be bad. So in other words, I'm not permitted to believe that her soul cycle class will be bad. But if this permissivist response is correct, I am permitted to believe that it will be bad. Sorry, that should be a not P. So we would still get a conflict just at a different level, at the permissibility level as opposed to at the obligation level. So that concludes the lecture for today. In the meantime, I would like you to think about whether or not you agree with the conflict thesis, and if not, which response do you find the most compelling as at least a starting point.